There are moments in life when just a single second is enough to change the direction of everything. Forever. Not with an explosion, not with a foretold disaster, but with something very small. So small that almost no one notices. For Jack Miller, that moment came on an ordinary Thursday morning, just like hundreds of other mornings in Mesa, Arizona, a town set in the middle of the desert where hot winds sweep across dust-covered roads and the sun seems to have never learned mercy. Jack was standing inside his old garage, bent beneath the engine cowling of an aging light aircraft. The smell of heated metal, grease, and sand blended in the air. His hands, calloused and stained with oil, moved slowly but precisely, without a single wasted motion. That was how Jack had worked for nearly 20 years. He was not a remarkable man. No one called him a genius. No one believed his life would ever be tied to anything extraordinary. Jack Miller, 42 years old, a civilian aircraft maintenance technician, a single father, a man the world had grown accustomed to overlooking. Jack's garage sat right against the steel fence of a small airport where old planes took off every day, carrying dreams that no longer belonged to him. The concrete walls were cracked and weathered. The ceiling was low. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead. No polished sign, no air-conditioned waiting room, only tools worn smooth from use, old technical manuals, and one man working quietly from sunrise until dusk swallowed the desert whole. Jack once had dreams, a long time ago. When he was young, he believed he would become an aerospace engineer. He used to stand on the sandy hills near the Air Force Base, watching aircraft tear through the sky, believing that if a person could truly understand how a machine managed to take flight, then perhaps a human being could rise above their own fate as well. But life does not follow blueprints. His wife, Sarah, passed away from illness just a few years after Emily, their only daughter, was born. The small house that had once been filled with laughter fell into a silence that hurt to endure. Jack learned how to be a father, a mother, and the sole support for a tiny life that had not yet learned why her mother no longer appeared each morning. And then there was Luke, his younger brother. Luke Miller had been the pride of the family, intelligent, strong, a young man with dreams larger than anyone Jack had ever known. Luke enlisted in the military, became a paratrooper, and later pursued a career in aerospace engineering. He loved the sky as much as Jack did, but believed he could fly even higher. The accident happened during what should have been a routine training exercise. A bad landing. A slight misalignment. In just a few seconds, Luke lost the ability to walk for the rest of his life. Jack still remembered clearly the day the doctor said the words, his voice steady and cold, as if reading technical specifications of a broken device. Severe spinal cord damage. No possibility of recovery. They tried everything. Major hospitals, top doctors. Surgeries are advertised with terminology that sounds like miracles, but the miracle never came. Luke grew thinner, not from physical pain, but from something far more profound. Before he passed away from pulmonary complications, he gripped Jack's hand tightly, his eyes still holding the strange calm of someone who had accepted his fate. "If you ever get the chance, Jack," Luke said weakly, "don't let people like me lose hope." The words did not sound like a final farewell. They sounded like a quiet command, and Jack carried them with him every single day. After Luke's death, Jack no longer trusted the system, but he still believed in understanding. He believed that if a person observed enough, patiently enough, even things that seemed impossible could be re-examined from a different angle. Every night, after Emily fell asleep, Jack stayed in the garage, not to repair cars or aircraft, but to read. Mechanics, load distribution, joint movement, how a structure bears weight without breaking. He studied like a man with nothing left to lose, because in truth, he had already lost too much. Emily, 8 years old, was the only light left in his life. She often sat in the corner of the garage, drawing strange machines with colored pencils, aircraft with wings unlike any others, gears misaligned, shapes childish yet full of curiosity. "Dad," Emily once asked, holding a small mechanical puppet Jack had made for her, "why doesn't this joint move smoothly?" Jack smiled and knelt at her eye level. "Because it hasn't been designed properly, sweetheart. When a joint is forced in the wrong direction, movement becomes painful." Jack did not know that those simple words would soon return to him in a completely different form. That morning, as Jack wiped the oil from his hands, an unfamiliar sound rose from the dirt road outside the garage. Not the usual engine noise of trucks or small planes. The sound was deep, smooth, powerful, tuned to near perfection. Jack looked up. A black Cadillac Escalade slowly came to a stop in front of the garage. Its polished surface reflected the desert sunlight like a mirror. It stood there, out of place among old vehicles and drifting dust, like a puzzle piece set into the wrong picture. The rear door opened. A young woman stepped out, slowly, carefully. Her legs were secured with refined, gleaming metal braces, hugging each knee joint and hip joint precisely. Every step was an effort concealed behind a fragile smile. Jack's eyes lingered for more than a second, not out of curiosity, not out of pity, but because of a deeply familiar sensation, the feeling of someone who had spent a lifetime around things that were not assembled correctly. Behind the young woman stood a middle-aged lady, posture straight, wearing a perfectly tailored suit. Her gaze was sharp, weary, and carried the controlled authority of someone long accustomed to power. Jack did not yet know their names. He did not know that his life was about to take a new direction. He knew only one thing: something was wrong. And sometimes, the very moment before we understand what is happening is when fate quietly begins to turn. Jack remained still for a few more seconds, not because he was overwhelmed by the expensive vehicle, but because a familiar sensation was rising in his chest. It was the same feeling he had whenever he saw an aircraft engine operating off-axis. Not loud, not smoking, but sure to fail if no one noticed in time. The middle-aged woman stepped forward. Her voice was low, concise, without a single unnecessary word. "My car is overheating. Can you check it?" Jack nodded. He didn't ask who they were, nor did he show curiosity. To him, it was simply a vehicle that needed fixing, and fixing machines was what he did best. "Sure," Jack said as he pulled the hood release. "You can sit and rest for a moment." The young woman slowly moved toward the old wooden chair in front of the garage. The metal braces hugging her legs made even the slightest movement difficult. She had to stop, adjust, and then sit down. Her face maintained a smile, but her eyes could not hide the exhaustion. Jack bent over the engine, but his gaze kept drifting back. Once, then twice, then again. Not because the girl was beautiful, but because of the way her body was compensating for a flawed design. The woman stood nearby with her arms crossed, watching Jack's every movement. She was accustomed to assessing people within the first few minutes, a habit of a CEO who had spent half her life in boardrooms and marketplaces. "How long have you been doing this?" she asked, her tone still distant. "More than 15 years, Jack replied without looking up. "I used to work in the Air Force, aircraft maintenance." The woman paused for a very brief instant, just enough for a perceptive person to notice, but too quick to be called a reaction. "I see," she said. "My name is Catherine Reynolds." Jack simply nodded. The name meant nothing to him. His world revolved around bolts, joints, and force distribution, not financial headlines. The young woman was different. She observed Jack not because of hope, but because she had grown used to not hoping. Over the past 11 years, she had seen hundreds of people like him, doctors, engineers, specialists, all saying impressive things, then leaving, returning her to the same old pain. Jack closed the hood. "Nothing serious," he said. "The cooling system is clogged. I'll take care of it quickly." Catherine exhaled in relief, but her eyes immediately returned to her daughter, as if her genuine concern had never been the car. Jack turned back to his workbench to grab his tools. Then he stopped, just for a second, a moment that, if ignored, would send everything back onto its old path. He walked toward the young woman, slowly, and knelt at her eye level. Not to appear kind, but because he had learned from Emily that speaking down to someone always creates a sense of distance. "I'm sorry," Jack said gently and carefully. "I don't want to make you uncomfortable, but may I ask you something?" The girl blinked, slightly surprised. Catherine immediately turned toward them. "What do you want to ask?" she said. Jack looked directly at the young woman, not at her legs, not at the braces. "That brace, when you move, does it hurt?" The air seemed to freeze. The young woman's eyes widened. For a few seconds, she didn't answer, not because she didn't know what to say, but because no one had ever asked her that question this way. "Yes," she said softly. "It hurts a lot." Catherine stepped forward. "What are you implying?" Her voice sharpened. "That is a top-of-the-line orthopedic device designed by the best engineers." Jack nodded. He didn't argue. "I believe you," he said. "It's very advanced, very expensive. But—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes something can be perfect on a blueprint, yet not fit a real human body." Catherine clenched her hand. She had heard similar words before from people selling hope, and she hated that. "Are you a doctor?" she asked. "No," Jack answered immediately. "I'm just a mechanic." The girl, Olivia, watched him more closely now, not because she believed him, but because her instincts told her that this man wasn't trying to convince anyone. Jack gestured toward the knee joint of the brace, keeping a respectful distance. "I won't touch it unless you agree," he said. "But may I observe?" Olivia turned to her mother. Catherine hesitated. A cascade of warnings, liabilities, and risks flooded her mind. Then she saw her daughter's eyes, the eyes of someone who had lived in pain for far too long. "All right," Catherine said, "but only look." Jack nodded. He observed the joint angle, the locking mechanism, the way Olivia shifted her weight when standing. Within minutes, the pieces began to fall into place in his mind, just like when he could identify a misaligned engine without taking it apart. "When you walk," Jack said slowly, "your knee joint is fixed at a rigid angle. That forces your hip to rotate to compensate." Olivia swallowed. "And because of that," Jack continued, "your lower back has to carry that extra load." Olivia whispered, her voice trembling. "How do you know? I have always had back pain." Jack didn't answer right away. He simply pointed gently at her sitting posture. "You're leaning about 7 degrees to the right. The body always tries to protect itself." Catherine stood frozen. 11 years, dozens of doctors. Not one had ever told her this. "Are you saying they were wrong?" she asked, her voice lowered. Jack shook his head. "No. I think they designed it for technology, for sensors, for data. But they forgot the simplest thing." He looked at Olivia. "They forgot to ask how your body wants to move." Olivia felt her throat tighten. She didn't know why, But for the first time in years, she felt like she wasn't a medical case. She was a person being listened to. "Can you fix it?" Olivia asked, almost in a whisper. Catherine spun around. "Olivia." Jack looked up, his expression serious but without promises. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I don't want to lie, but if you allow me, I can try." No one spoke. The desert wind passed through the garage, carrying dust and heat with it. Catherine looked at the man before her, oil-stained clothes, calloused hands, and inside her, a fierce battle rose between logic and something else, more fragile, yet far stronger. She took a deep breath. "We'll talk later," Catherine said. "Today, we're just fixing the car." Jack nodded. He didn't push. But when Catherine and Olivia later drove away, Jack stood still, watching them go. In his mind, a familiar voice echoed, Luke's voice. "Don't let them lose hope." Jack didn't know whether he was capable or not. He only knew that he had seen something he could no longer pretend he hadn't seen. And sometimes, the very moment we can't turn away is when the path ahead begins to open. That night, the lights in Jack's garage stayed on. Cold fluorescent light spilt over the old workbench where layers of scratches overlapped like the marks of time itself. Outside, the Arizona desert was eerily silent, broken only by the dry wind sliding through the steel fence. Jack sat in front of the brace he had seen earlier that afternoon, not touching it, merely placing it there like a question still waiting for its answer. He was not in a hurry. Jack had never been a man who rushed. He knew this. Every decision carried consequences. In his mind, images surfaced, one after another. Luke was lying in a hospital bed, his strained smile paired with calm eyes. Emily was asleep in a chair, her small hand still clutching a mechanical puppet. And then Olivia. The tired gaze, the unsettling calm of someone who had learned how to live with pain. Jack stood up and walked around the brace. He did not view it as a medical device, but rather as a machine operating off-axis. Everything had a reason. Everything followed rules. If there was pain, then force was being applied in the wrong place. He picked up a pen and opened his notebook. No elaborate blueprints, just simple lines. Knee joint, hip, force axis. He drew and redrew the same motion, the human step, the very thing that hundreds of pages of technical documentation sometimes forgot. Jack did not sleep. He couldn't. At dawn, Emily walked into the garage, her hair messy, her eyes still heavy with sleep. "You still haven't slept, Dad?" she asked softly. Jack smiled and rubbed her head. "I'm fine, sweetheart." Emily looked at the brace on the table, then at her father's exhausted face. She didn't ask anything else. She had learned that sometimes the only question needed was presence. That afternoon, Jack called Catherine Reynolds. Her voice came through the phone, still carrying the distance of someone used to controlling every situation. "Have you thought this through?" Catherine asked. "I need to be clear. If there's any risk, I understand," Jack interrupted, his voice calm. "I won't do anything without both of your consents. And if there's any sign of danger, I stop immediately." A brief silence followed on the other end of the line. "All right," Catherine finally said. "We'll come back. But I'll be there, and I'll watch every step." Jack nodded, even though he knew she couldn't see him. "That's enough." The Cadillac appeared in front of the garage again that afternoon. This time there was no initial curiosity, only tightly contained tension. Olivia stepped out of the car, more carefully than before. Catherine stayed close, her eyes never leaving her daughter. Jack greeted them with a short nod and pulled his work chair closer. I'm only adjusting a small part, Jack said, as if reassuring both of them and himself. I'm not changing the main structure. He asked for permission, then knelt. His hands touched the cold metal, feeling every joint. He loosened one point, adjusted a very slight angle, something that might seem insignificant to others, but to Jack, it felt like turning the correct gear that had long been misaligned. How does it feel? Jack asked quietly. Lighter, Olivia replied, surprised. Easier to breathe. Catherine looked at Jack, her gaze caught between suspicion and fragile hope. That's it? That's it, Jack said. Take it slow. Olivia stood up. One step, then a second. For the first few seconds, everything appeared to be fine. Jack held his breath. Catherine clenched her hands. Then suddenly, a cry of pain tore through the air. Olivia collapsed. Metal scraped against skin. Blood seeped from her ankle. Catherine screamed and rushed forward, pulling her daughter into her arms. Stop! Stop right now! She shouted, her voice breaking in panic. Jack stood frozen. His hands trembled, smeared with blood, a familiar, brutal image. In his mind, the hospital room from years ago resurfaced. Luke. The smell of antiseptic. The suffocating sense of helplessness. I'm sorry, Jack said hoarsely. I'm so sorry. Catherine didn't look at him. She helped Olivia sit up, her hands shaking with both anger and fear. We're leaving, she said coldly. I was wrong to trust you. Olivia was helped into the car. Before the door closed, she turned to look at Jack. Her eyes were wet, but there was no blame in them. Don't give up, Olivia said softly. Please. The car drove away, leaving the garage submerged in silence. That night, Jack sat alone on the cold concrete floor. The brace lay motionless on the table, the blood not yet wiped away. He held his phone, his fingers trembling over the screen, ready to call Catherine and bring everything to an end. Maybe I went too far, he thought. Maybe my promise to Luke wasn't enough. The small door opened. Emily stood there holding a cup of warm milk. Drink it, Dad, she said, her voice unusually serious. You need strength. Jack took the cup but didn't drink from it. Are you scared, Emily? He asked. If Dad fails? Emily shook her head. If you don't try, you'll regret it for the rest of your life. Just like Uncle Luke. Jack closed his eyes. Words from an 8-year-old child, yet heavier than any advice he had ever heard. Late that night, after Emily had fallen asleep, Jack returned to the table. He looked at the drawings, at the brace, at his own hands. He realized the mistake, not in the adjustment itself, but in the way he had approached it. He had attempted to rectify a design that was flawed at its core. He whispered, as if speaking to himself. Not the joint, not the force, the center of balance. A message arrived, making the phone vibrate softly on the table. Jack, I'm sorry for how my mother reacted today. I'm okay, and I still believe in you. Olivia. Jack stared at the screen. This time, the tears that fell were not from despair, but from responsibility. He stood up and turned the lights brighter, took fresh paper, a new pen. No more fixing. Redesign from the beginning. Outside, the desert wind continued to blow. Inside, one man quietly began the greatest battle of his life. Not against the system, not against regulations, but against the fear of failure that had followed him for so many years. And somewhere in his memory, Luke's voice echoed, no longer weak. Don't apologize. Just keep going. Jack took a deep breath. He leaned over the drafting table. And this time, He did not allow himself to give up. From that night on, Jack Miller nearly disappeared from the world. The small garage near the airport is no longer open to customers. Familiar faces who stopped by saw only a hastily handwritten sign in marker. Closed for a few days. But inside, the lights never went out. Jack worked as if time no longer existed. He slept in fragments, 2 or 3 hours a night, waking with the same haunting images burned into his mind. Olivia collapsing, metal scraping against flesh, Catherine's scream of terror. And deeper than all of it, the look in Luke's eyes from memory, not accusing, only waiting. Jack stopped fixing. He erased everything. Old sketches were torn up, crumpled, and thrown into the corner. Calculations based on traditional medical designs were crossed out without mercy. Jack started over from zero, the way he had once learned to understand aircraft engines, not through textbooks, but through principles. He stood up and walked through the garage himself, observing his own body. One step, weight transfer, shift of balance. Humans don't move like machines with locked joints, Jack whispered. Humans move like self-balancing systems. He remembered his years in the Air Force, where he studied aircraft load distribution. If the center of gravity is wrong, no matter how powerful the engine, the aircraft will vibrate, waste energy, and eventually fail. Not the knee, Jack said aloud. It's the hip. The center of balance had to be at the hip. The realization was not dramatic. There was no lightning bolt, no surge of triumph, just a cold clarity, the kind that brings both relief and fear. Because if this was true, then everything before it had been wrong. Jack began redesigning the entire structure, not around the knee joint, but around the hip axis. He changed how forces were distributed so the body didn't have to endure the device but cooperate with it. The metal was trimmed down, the materials were lighter, contact points were wrapped in soft medical-grade silicone. Emily brought food to her father every day. She didn't ask many questions. She simply set the plate down quietly, looking at the dense sketches and her father's red, sleepless eyes. "Are you tired, Dad?" Emily asked once. Jack smiled. "I am, but I'm doing the right thing." Emily nodded, as if that answer was enough. After 6 days, Jack stood before an entirely new brace. It wasn't glossy, it wasn't impressive, but when he held it, he felt something different. Balance. Jack stared at it for a long time. Then he picked up his phone. He hesitated for nearly 20 minutes before making the call. "Catherine Reynolds," her voice answered, cold and weary. "It's me, Jack," he said. "I know you have no reason left to trust me, but I started over from scratch." A silence stretched, suffocating. "You know my daughter has already been injured twice," Catherine said slowly. "If anything happens again, I'll stop." Immediately at the first sign of danger, Jack interrupted, his voice firm. "And I'm not doing this to prove I'm right. I'm doing it because I can't ignore what I've seen." Catherine closed her eyes. In her mind, 2 voices clashed violently, reason and the heart. In the end, the heart was weaker, but it refused to be silent. "All right," she said. "One last time. But I'll bring Olivia's orthopedic doctor. He'll observe everything." Jack nodded. That's for the best. The next morning, the garage opened again. The Cadillac stopped in front of the garage, but this time Catherine and Olivia were not alone. An older man stepped out, the orthopedic doctor who had been following Olivia's case for years. His expression was stern, tinged with skepticism. "You're a mechanic?" he asked bluntly. "Yes," Jack replied, "and I understand your concern." The doctor said nothing more. He simply stepped aside, arms crossed, ready to intervene at any moment. Olivia looked at Jack. She didn't smile. She didn't speak. She only nodded slightly, a silent commitment. Jack fitted the new brace slowly, step by step. No rushing, no shortcuts. He checked every strap, every joint, every contact point, as if a single mistake could destroy everything. "How does it feel?" Jack asked. "Light," Olivia answered. "Very light." Jack stood up and stepped back. "This time, I won't support you," he said. "You have to stand on your own. But I'm here." Olivia took a deep breath. Catherine gripped her daughter's hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. The orthopedic doctor leaned forward, ready to rush in. Olivia stood up. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. There was no cry of pain. I don't hurt," Olivia whispered, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the moment. Jack swallowed. "Trust your body," he said softly. "It knows what to do." Olivia took her first step. No pain. The second step. The knee bent naturally. The hip rotated slightly. No pain. Catherine raised a hand to her mouth, tears overflowing uncontrollably. The orthopedic doctor stared wide-eyed, forgetting to maintain his composure. "That's impossible," he murmured. Olivia kept walking. A third step. A fourth. Her body trembled, not from pain, but from a sensation absent for 11 long years. "I'm walking," Olivia cried. "Mom, I'm walking." Catherine collapsed onto the garage floor, tears falling soundlessly. Every apology, every year of torment, every attempt to bargain with fate, all of it shattered in that moment. Jack leaned against the workbench, gripping its edge with both hands to keep from collapsing. Before his eyes, Luke appeared, not lying in a hospital bed, but standing upright, smiling. He didn't give up, Jack thought. This time, he didn't give up. Olivia took a few more steps. Then suddenly she smiled through her tears, a free smile, unrestrained. The orthopedic doctor stepped forward and knelt to observe the movement. He measured joint angles, watched the force distribution, and fell silent. "This design," he said slowly, "it goes against everything we've been doing." Jack looked at him. "But it follows how humans actually move." No one argued. In that moment, it wasn't just a young woman who stood up. An old system of belief began to shake, and Jack knew, deep in his heart, that from this moment on, his life would never return to what it had been before. Because when an ordinary person proves that the impossible is often nothing more than something no one has dared to do differently, the world will not allow him to walk alone. Miracles are never loud at the moment they happen, but their aftershocks are. That afternoon, after Catherine and Olivia left the garage, Jack stood alone for a long time. The concrete floor still bore the marks of Olivia's first trembling steps. The air seemed frozen, carrying the scent of freshly cut metal and tears not yet dried. Jack knew that the moment the car door closed, this story no longer belonged to him alone. He was right. Just a few hours later, Jack's phone began to vibrate. At first, it was neighbors, then old friends, then strangers saying they had heard about the girl who walked again at the garage near the airport. Jack didn't answer them all. He turned off the ringer and placed the phone face down on the table. In that rare moment, he only wanted to sit still, to let his breathing slow, to let his heart stop pounding. But the outside world did not give him time. The next morning, a thick white envelope lay neatly in front of the garage door. No stamp, no decorative logo, just one bold, cold line of text. Legal notice. Jack picked up the envelope with both hands. He didn't need to open it to guess its contents. But as he read each dry, formal line inside, a chill still ran down his spine. Mr. Daniel Jack Miller has engaged in the unauthorized modification and intervention of a medical orthopedic device without a valid professional license or certified biomedical engineering credentials. This action constitutes a violation of FDA regulations governing Class II medical devices. Jack sank into the old wooden chair. The letter slipped from his hands and fell to the floor. Emily walked out of the house and saw her father sitting with his head lowered, his back slightly trembling. "What will they do to you, Dad?" she asked quietly. Jack took a deep breath. "They might sue me." Emily was silent. Then she stepped forward and took her father's hand. "You helped someone walk," she said simply. "Is that wrong?" Jack had no answer. The news spread faster than he expected. A brief article appeared on a local medical blog and was then subsequently shared across social media. No sensational photos, no inflammatory headline, just a strange story. An Arizona mechanic helps a girl paralyzed for 11 years walk again. The reaction came immediately, and it was far from unanimous. Some called Jack a living miracle. Some called him a dangerous risk-taker. Others asked, what if it fails next time? The orthopedic doctor from that day called Catherine first. "I can't publicly support him," he said heavily. "If I do, I'll lose my license. I saw what happened, but the system doesn't operate on emotion." Catherine understood, but this time, she did not stay silent. 2 days later, she stood in front of a small press room filled with reporters. No grand stage, no dazzling lights, just a wooden podium, a microphone, and a young woman standing beside her, without a wheelchair. When Olivia stepped forward, the room fell silent for several seconds. Murmurs stopped. Cameras froze. Catherine looked straight into the lens. "For 11 years, she said clearly, I spent millions of dollars on the best experts. My daughter was still in pain, still unable to walk. And then, a man without degrees, without reputation, did what none of us could." A reporter raised his hand. "Aren't you concerned about the risks? He has no certification." Catherine did not evade the question. "What allowed my daughter to walk again," she replied, "was not a credential. It was a human being who chose to see her as a human being." Olivia stepped forward, her voice trembling but steady. "I don't need anyone to promise miracles," she said. "I just needed someone to listen to my body. Jack did that." The video was shared millions of times within days. But the more people learned about Jack, the greater the pressure became. The Arizona State Orthopedic Association issued an official statement. "We sympathize with the patient's case, but we cannot permit unqualified individuals to interfere with medical devices." The law began knocking on the door. Jack was summoned to meetings with a team of lawyers, rapid-fire questions, cold legal terminology. He answered everything slowly, honestly. "I didn't do this to challenge the system," Jack said. "I did it because someone was in pain." "Do you understand that if something goes wrong, you will be held liable?" one lawyer asked. Jack nodded. "I understand." Catherine offered to hire the best legal team for him. "Let me handle it," she said. "You don't have to fight alone." Jack shook his head immediately. "If I let you do that," he said, "this becomes a battle of money. And then people like Olivia will become afraid. They won't dare to believe in anything again." Catherine looked at him, her eyes reddened. "Then what will you do?" Jack thought for a long time. Then he answered, his voice strangely calm. "I will take responsibility for what I did." but I will not apologize for helping someone stand up. That night, the garage lights went out early. Jack sat on the porch, gazing at the star-filled desert sky. Emily sat beside him, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Do you regret it, Dad?" she asked. Jack shook his head. "If I had turned away, that's what I couldn't live with." A knock sounded at the door, soft but firm. A woman stood before Jack. Her hair was neatly tied back, her eyes were sharp yet warm. "I'm Dr. Victoria Morgan," she said, professor of biomedical engineering at Stanford. Jack froze slightly. "I'd like to see your design." Jack led her inside. They spoke very little. Dr. Morgan studied the brace for a long time, rotating each joint, measuring force axes, and taking continuous notes. 30 minutes passed in silence. Finally, she looked up and removed her glasses. "You're self-taught?" she asked. "Yes." "No one taught you about dynamic center of balance distribution?" "No." She smiled, a rare smile in academic circles. "You know," she said slowly, "if the system sues you, it may actually be suing its own stagnation." Jack looked at her, speechless. "I'll testify for you," Dr. Morgan continued, "before the FDA, before any board." Jack felt his throat tighten. "Why?" he asked. "Because in 30 years of research," she replied, "I have rarely seen someone place human beings above models the way you did." After she left, Jack sat alone in the garage. He looked at the brace, no longer just a device, but a choice. The road ahead would not be easy. The law, the media, the system, all of it was waiting for him. But deep in his heart, Jack knew one thing clearly. He had kept his promise to Luke. And some promises are worth trading an entire lifetime for. The FDA hearing room had no bright lights, no applause. It was simply a large room with high ceilings and white walls where everything was weighed through careful language and thick files. Emotions were rarely invited there. But that morning, emotion was present nonetheless, quietly, persistently, like an underground current. Jack Miller sat upright on a wooden chair. His clothes were neat and straightforward. The hands, once hardened by oil and grease, now rested calmly on his knees, not trembling. He had not come to prove he was right. He had come to take responsibility. Catherine Reynolds sat behind him, her gaze both resolute and anxious. Olivia sat beside her mother, without a wheelchair. That fact alone caused several people in the room to change their expressions subtly. The hearing began. Legal representatives read out statutes, regulations, and precedents. Dry words passed through the room like cold air. Then it was Dr. Victoria Morgan's turn to speak. She did not begin with her credentials. She did not list laboratories. She placed the brace on the table, gently rotated it, and pointed to the hip axis. "This design," she said slowly and clearly, "places the center of balance in the correct position, not according to outdated textbooks, but according to how the human body actually moves." A board member asked, "Are you suggesting that the entire current approach is wrong?" Dr. Morgan shook her head. "No, I am saying it is incomplete. And sometimes, those not bound by academic habits see what the rest of us overlook." She turned toward Jack. "Mr. Miller did not break science. He returned science to the human body." The room fell silent. Then Olivia stood up. No one asked her to. She simply stood, an act that had been impossible for her for 11 years. "I am not here to challenge the law," Olivia said, her voice calm but deep. "I am here to say that, for the first time in a very long time, I can walk without pain. That happened because someone listened to me." Catherine placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "For 11 years," she said, "I believed money and power could buy solutions. Today I learned that presence and understanding are what truly guide the way." The board called for a recess. The waiting period felt endless. Jack looked through the glass and saw the pale blue sky. He thought of the old garage, the smell of oil, the desert wind. He thought of Luke, of Emily, of the promise he was never allowed to betray. At last, the board returned. The decision was read slowly, carefully. The FDA grants a special authorization to Mr. Daniel Jack Miller to continue designing and improving orthopedic devices under the scientific supervision of Dr. Victoria Morgan for a period of 2 years, with a pathway toward formal certification. Jack closed his eyes. Not in victory, but in relief. He did not raise his hands. He simply bowed his head and whispered inside, "Luke, I kept my promise." The news spread, this time no longer as murmurs. Yet Jack returned to his old garage. He opened the doors, cleaned up, and repaired the workbench. Neighbors stopped by. Some patted his shoulder. Some cried. A small sign was hung, "Miller Mobility Lab, making hope walk again." No flash, no grand slogan, just a sentence that said enough. In the days that followed, Jack worked tirelessly, but unlike before, he was no longer alone. Dr. Morgan came often, bringing textbooks, protocols, and the rare humility of someone willing to learn from reality. They debated, tested, adjusted, science and intuition meeting at a shared center, the human being. Olivia began physical therapy. She returned to the garage every day, helping newcomers, not with promises of miracles, but with companionship. She knew that fear, and she knew that what people needed most was not to be left alone. Emily, now 9 years old, sat in the corner drawing. This time, her machines had clear hip axes, balanced gears. She looked at her father and asked softly, "Would Uncle Luke be proud?" Jack pulled her into his arms. "He would be very proud." One afternoon, Catherine and Olivia returned to Pacific Beach. Gentle waves, salty wind. Olivia stepped onto the sand slowly. Then she smiled as the seawater touched her feet. "I can feel it," she said, her voice trembling with happiness. Catherine cried, but this time the tears were no longer heavy. She understood that forgiveness does not come from forgetting the past, but from fully inhabiting the present. Time passed. 2 years later, Jack completed his biomedical engineering certification, not for status, but for responsibility. Miller Mobility Lab had helped hundreds of people, many of whom could not afford care. Jack always said the same thing. "We start by looking at how you move, not at what you lack." On the day the new center opened, there was no ribbon-cutting ceremony, just a small plaque at the entrance, engraved with the words, "Dedicated to Luke Miller for the promise that never gave up." The sun set over the Arizona desert. Jack, Catherine, Olivia, and Emily sat on the sand. The sky glowed with soft shades of orange. Olivia stood, took a few steps, then turned back. "Thank you," she said to Jack. "You didn't give me a miracle. You gave me a chance." Jack smiled. "You were the one who walked." Emily looked up and asked, "Are you happy, Dad?" Jack nodded. "Very happy. Because there are promises that, when kept, change the world. Just a little." And perhaps that is what this story is truly about. Not about a mechanic, not about a CEO, not about a device, but about kindness that knows how to listen, and hands that refuse to give up. There are stories that, when they end, you close the book and smile. But there are other stories, those that, just when you think they have ended, are only beginning to echo. For Jack Miller, life after receiving the special license from the FDA did not become easier. It simply became more meaningful. Every morning, the old garage by the small airport still opened its doors as it always had. No large signs, no reception desk, just the soft clinking of metal, the slow footsteps of people who had grown accustomed to living with pain. But now, they didn't come just to fix machines. They came to be listened to. The first person after Olivia was a 10-year-old boy named Ethan, born with cerebral palsy from a working-class family, without full insurance, without enough money for any standard orthopedic device. His mother carried him into the garage, his face caught between fear and hope. Hope so fragile that a single refusal could have shattered it. Jack knelt to Ethan's eye level. "Can you show me how you move?" Jack asked, the way he always began. Not, "What's wrong with you?" Not, "Where's your medical file?" But, "What can you do?" Ethan took a few unsteady steps, then stopped, breathing hard. Jack watched for a long time. No notes, no words. Just watching, as if listening to a story without sound. "I'll help you," Jack said at last. The boy's mother broke down in tears. "We don't have money." Jack shook his head. "I didn't ask about money." The story of that small garage spread, not through loud media coverage, but through the voices of those who had been helped, in hospitals, in physical therapy waiting rooms, and in ordinary, everyday conversations. "A mechanic in Arizona. He doesn't promise miracles. He just asks where it hurts." Not everyone walked again. Jack never claimed that everyone would have a miracle, but strangely enough, everyone who left that garage walked a little lighter, even if only in their minds. Dr. Victoria Morgan recognized this early on. One late evening, as the two of them sat reviewing drawings, she said to Jack, "You know, what you've created isn't just a device. It's an entirely different approach." Jack looked up. "What do you mean?" "Modern medicine," she said slowly, "sometimes forgets that patients are not equations. You're different. You start from their stories." Jack remained silent. He had never thought of himself as doing medicine. He was only doing what Luke had once hoped he would do. Don't let others lose hope. Olivia, now a senior student in rehabilitation sciences, has become an indispensable part of the Miller Mobility Lab. She didn't lecture. She didn't seek media attention. She sat beside patients and shared her journey, not to show off a miracle, but to say, "I've been where you are." Once, a middle-aged man said to her, "I'm scared. I've failed too many times." Olivia smiled and placed her hand on his arm. "So have I," she said, "but we're still here." Emily grew up surrounded by those stories. She no longer drew strange machines. Instead, she drew people in motion, not perfect, but balanced. She learned how to hold tools, how to observe, and most importantly, how to be patient. One evening, Emily asked her father, "If you hadn't asked that question that day, what would have happened?" Jack thought for a long time. "Maybe everything would have gone on the same," he said. "But I wouldn't have been able to live at peace with myself." Emily nodded, then said something that made Jack freeze. "Then you're not the one who creates miracles. You're just the one who doesn't turn away." Jack held her tightly. Some lessons take adults a lifetime to learn. The children grasp them very quickly. Not everyone in the medical world accepted Jack's approach. There were still skeptical articles, heated conference debates, people who called him a dangerous exception. Jack read it all. He didn't argue. He didn't avoid it either. He simply kept working. because every morning when he saw someone stand up who hadn't dared to try the day before, he knew he was on the right path. One day, Jack received a handwritten letter. No title, no famous signature. I am a doctor who has practiced for 25 years. I once thought I knew enough, until I saw one of my patients walk after leaving your garage. Thank you for reminding me why I started. Jack folded the letter and placed it in a drawer beside Luke's old photograph. That afternoon, Jack took Emily, Olivia, and Catherine to the beach. Not to celebrate anything, just an ordinary afternoon, something they had once believed was a luxury. Olivia stepped onto the sand, letting the water touch her feet. She didn't run. She no longer needed to prove anything. She simply stood there, breathing, feeling each wave as it passed. Before, she said, I thought miracles were something that happened only once. Jack looked toward the horizon. No, he said. Miracles happen every time someone chooses to stay. The sun slowly set. Orange light washed over the four of them. Not perfect, not heroic, but brave enough not to give up. And perhaps that is how great stories truly begin. Not with a loud sound, but with a small question, asked at the right moment by someone who refuses to turn away. After a while, people stopped referring to it as a miracle. Not because it was no longer extraordinary, but because it had become part of everyday life. Mornings at the garage by the small airport still began the same way. Desert wind slipped through the door cracks. Early sunlight fell across the worn concrete floor. Jack Miller opened the doors, hung his jacket on the old hook, and took a long breath, as a habit he had never let go of. Some days were crowded. On some days only a few slow-moving figures appeared. But every day shared one thing in common. No one walked into this place feeling like they were broken. Jack never hung his degrees on the wall, not because he didn't have them, but because he didn't want anyone to think their story began with a piece of paper. He always started with the same question, a question that sounded simple yet had changed so many lives. Can you show me how you move? Not, what can't you do? Not, what are you missing? But, what do you have? Some people came in with doubtful eyes. Some arrived because they had run out of options. Others came in silence, carrying a lifetime of being looked at with pity. Jack made no promises. He offered no empty comfort. He observed, he listened, and he respected every small boundary. Because after everything he had lived through, Jack understood one thing clearly. What hurts people most is not pain, but being ignored. Olivia understood that better than anyone. To Jack, she was no longer the girl who walked after 11 years. She was Olivia, a young woman learning how to live fully in her body, one day at a time. Some afternoons, after everyone had gone home, Olivia stayed behind to wipe the tables and organize the tools. No one asked her to. She simply did it as a way of thanking life for giving her more time. Once she asked Jack, "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you had turned away that day?" Jack paused, thinking for a long time. "I think," he said slowly, "the most frightening thing isn't failure. It's living your whole life with the question, what if I had tried?" Olivia nodded. She understood. Catherine Reynolds changed too, quietly but profoundly. She was still a CEO, still in meetings, still making decisions and running companies. But now her schedule always had open spaces, reserved for Olivia. Mother and daughter no longer spoke much about mistakes. They spoke about tiny things, a breakfast, a short walk, a breezy afternoon. Once Catherine said softly, maybe the hardest thing isn't forgiving others, but forgiving yourself. Olivia took her mother's hand. "We're here," she said. "That's enough." Emily grew up among people who once believed they had no road left to walk. She learned that strength isn't about moving fast, but about daring to stand up again, even after falling many times. One evening, Emily asked her father, "What do you think Uncle Luke is doing now?" Jack looked up at the sky where aeroplanes glided slowly overhead. "Maybe," he said, "he's smiling, because the promise wasn't forgotten." Time passed and the story gradually moved beyond the small garage, not through sensational headlines, but through whispered conversations in hospital waiting rooms. "I heard there's a place in Arizona. He doesn't make you feel like a medical case. He looks at you like a human being." Some doctors came, not to argue, but to observe. Some medical students came just to ask one question. How do you keep from losing the feeling you had when you first started this profession? Jack didn't lecture. He simply told Luke's story and let the silence do the rest. Because some lessons don't need to be taught. They only need to be remembered. One late autumn afternoon, the garage was quiet. Jack stood alone, wiping down the workbench. He looked around, the old walls, the worn tools, the traces of countless unsteady first steps. He didn't think he had changed the world. He only knew that, in a few tiny places, the world had become a little gentler. And maybe that was enough. Because if each person chose to stay a little longer, to listen one more time, to ask one more question, then fewer people would have to live their entire lives feeling like a burden. Ultimately, this story isn't about medicine. It isn't about money. It isn't about genius. It's about presence. About someone who didn't turn away. About a question asked at the right moment. About imperfect hands that refused to give up. Something extraordinary happened after everything had settled down. No more reporters were waiting outside the garage. No more legal letters arriving every week. No more heated arguments on social media. Life, in its most natural way, returned to normal. But the people who had once walked through that garage door were never the same again. Jack Miller still woke up very early every morning. He brewed coffee with the old kettle, leaned against the doorframe, and watched the sun rise behind the distant mountains. That habit had never changed. Only one thing was different. He no longer felt like he was merely surviving each day. He was living with intention. The small garage was no longer just a place for repairs or experiments. It had become a hub for creativity. It became a strange kind of space, one where people came not to be fixed, but to be understood. There, stories were told slowly, sometimes fragmented, sometimes catching in the throat halfway through. Jack learned that for many people the hardest thing was not standing up again, but believing they deserved to try. There was an older woman named Margaret, a former elementary school teacher. She walked into the garage with trembling legs from joint degeneration, her eyes heavy with shame. "I don't expect to walk as I used to," she said. "I just want to step into my garden by myself every morning." Jack promised nothing big. He simply nodded. A few weeks later, Margaret sent him a photo. She stood in her small garden, early sunlight illuminating her wrinkled but radiant face. The caption beneath it had only one sentence. "Today, I stepped outside on my own." Jack placed the photo into a drawer, along with many other small moments the outside world would never call miracles. As Olivia continued to learn and work, she began to notice something that deeply troubled her. Many patients arrived carrying not only physical pain, but also an invisible shame accumulated after years of being seen through the eyes of pity or doubt. One evening, she said to Jack, "Some people aren't hurting because they can't walk, but because they believe they've become a burden." Jack nodded. "That's why I always ask what they can do, not what they lack." Catherine Reynolds also began a journey of her own. She returned to major conferences, but this time she didn't speak about new technologies or investments. She spoke about the ethical responsibility of listening. Some in the audience were uncomfortable. Some lowered their heads in thought. After one talk, a young investor approached her and asked, "If there hadn't been Jack, what do you think would have happened to your daughter?" Catherine was silent for a long time. "Perhaps," she said slowly, "she would still be alive. But I'm not sure she would truly be living." That answer spread, not because it was shocking, but because it was too real to avoid. Emily grew up among people who once believed their lives had come to a standstill. She observed, listened, and gradually understood not everyone needs to be saved. Some people only need to be trusted. One day, Emily wrote in her notebook, "If I see someone struggling, I won't ask what's wrong with them. I'll ask what they need." Jack read it and had to turn away to hide his emotion. He understood that his most incredible legacy was not in designs or rehabilitation centers, but in a way of seeing that had been passed on. Time continued to move forward. Miller Mobility Lab did not expand aggressively. Jack declined many investment offers, not because he feared change, but because he understood that moving too fast would cause the core to be lost. He often reminded Dr. Morgan and Olivia, "If one day we no longer have enough time to truly listen to each person, then we should stop." And they agreed. One late-year afternoon, the garage was quiet. Jack sat alone, looking at the worn marks on the floor, places where someone had stood up for the first time, where someone had fallen and stood again. He didn't remember all their names, but he remembered the feeling, the moment when someone realized they had not been abandoned. Jack thought about Luke. If Luke hadn't said those words that day, if Jack had turned away, perhaps this story would never have existed. But then he realized, this story didn't depend on him. It depended on countless small moments when someone chose to stay, even when turning away would have been far easier. And perhaps you, the one still reading to the very end, are standing at such a moment right now. Maybe with a loved one. Perhaps with a decision you've been putting off. Maybe with yourself. When this story comes to a close, there are no fireworks, no prolonged applause, no framed victory moment put on display. There is only a very ordinary afternoon. The sun slowly sinks beyond the horizon, painting the Arizona sky in soft shades of orange. The desert wind blows gently, carrying dust and the lingering warmth of a long day. The small garage by the airport is closed, lights off, no metal clinking, no cautious footsteps. Only silence remains. Jack Miller leans against the doorframe holding a cup of coffee gone cold. He isn't thinking about what he has achieved. He's thinking about what he almost missed. If that day he had turned away, if he hadn't asked that question, if he had let fear of failure decide for him, his life and the lives of so many others might have taken a completely different path. But Jack also understands one thing clearly. He didn't do anything extraordinary. He didn't defeat the system. He didn't prove anyone wrong. He didn't become a hero. He simply stayed. Stayed a little longer when turning away was easier. Stayed with doubt when silence felt safer. Stood with the person in front of him rather than hiding behind procedures. And sometimes, that alone is enough. Olivia stands not far away, barefoot on the sand. She doesn't run. She doesn't need to prove that she can. She simply stands, letting the waves touch her feet, feeling the cool water, something that had been taken from her far too early. She knows that the ability to walk wasn't the only gift she received. The greater gift was trust, that her body was not a traitor, that she was not a burden, that her pain had once been truly heard. Catherine stands behind her, quietly watching her daughter. The suffocating guilt that once crushed her chest is gone. In its place is a fragile kind of relief, the kind that appears only when we stop punishing ourselves. She understands something that takes many people a lifetime to accept. You cannot fix the past with power, but you can be fully present in the present. Emily sits on the sand, drawing uneven lines with a stick. She doesn't draw machines. She doesn't draw gears. She draws footprints, some dark, some faint, some overlapping. "Dad," Emily asks without looking up, "if someone can't walk anymore, does that mean they've lost all hope?" Jack sits down beside her, thinking for a long time. "No," he says softly. "Hope doesn't live in the legs. It lives in knowing that someone believes you still have a path to walk." Emily nods, then draws one more footprint, smaller but clear. Perhaps that is what this story wants to leave behind. Not a spectacular miracle, not a dazzling victory, but a different way of seeing. People don't need to be fixed before they deserve respect. That pain doesn't need proof to be worthy of being heard. That sometimes the right question matters more than a perfect answer. Don't turn away too quickly, because it might be that at the very moment you're about to leave, it's when someone needs you to stay the most. And if you've watched all the way to these final seconds, perhaps you're carrying a story of your own, a hesitation, a moment when you once chose silence or are about to. No one asks you to become Jack. No one expects you to do something extraordinary. Just remember this. Kindness, when held on to at the right moment, can change an entire path. If this story made you slow down for even a moment, please save that feeling. If you think someone else might need to be reminded that they haven't been forgotten, please share this story. And tell us in the comments, which moment in the story made you stay until the end? Don't forget to subscribe to Deep Life Tales, where we don't tell stories to make noise, but to remind ourselves. Kindness, when it refuses to give up, can change a life, one step at a time. See you on the next journey.